Hello and welcome to java9s.com. In this session, we're going to discuss about the introduction to Spring 3 MVC framework. Let us see some of the advantages of Spring 3 MVC framework. The first advantage is that it supports the RESTful URLs. We'll see what is a RESTful URL in a future session. And the second advantage is that most of the configuration can be done in Java annotations. That means you can evidence a lesser part of the XML based configuration in your XML applications. And it also supports to plug with other frameworks like Struts, WebWorks, or any other MVC framework. And finally, it gives a very high flexibility to work with the view technologies like JSP, Velocity, XML, PDF, or even tiles, etc. Let us see what is a model view controller architecture. This has been famous for a very long time, and it's one of the important architecture that gives a clear layered architecture to all the applications. So when a request lands up, the controller is the one which takes the responsibility and it delegates that request to a particular model. Model can be your service layer or your DAO, which gives some information about the request or requested information, or model can be a POJO which can hold some data given by the controller. And once the model job is done, the controller invokes the view, and view gets some data from the model if it is a POJO, and whatever the data that needs to be displayed to the client will be requested from the model object, and then response will be sent back. So the model can act as an entire layered architecture which can have more layers in terms of getting the information and something like that. So let us go ahead and see what is a front controller. A front controller is a very important component, which is the one which routes all the requests into the framework control. That means whenever the request lands up at the front controller, it gives that request to the control of the framework. Without this, MVC frameworks will not be able to take the control of the requests that are landing at the application. So front controller is not just there to capture the request, it also helps to initialize some of the very important components of the frameworks to run. That means it can help to load the map of URL, and the component needs to be invoked when a request lands with that URL. And also apart from that, it can also load some of the most important components like what view needs to be invoked or something like that. So we'll see what is the role that is being played by the front controller in a Spring 3 MVC. In Spring 3 MVC, it is a dispatcher servlet which acts as a front controller. So whenever a request lands up, the dispatcher servlet consults the handler mapping. A handler mapping is a component which will have the map of a URL and the controller which needs to be invoked for that particular request which lands up with the URL. So dispatcher servlet will get the information of what is the controller that needs to be invoked, and then that controller will be invoked. And the controller can request the model for some information. I told you that model can be your service layer or your DO layer, something which can get some information from the database, or even it can be a POJO which the controller can put some information into the POJO. And once the process is being done, the dispatcher servlet will get the response, and then dispatcher servlet initiates the view resolver to build the view. And view resolver will look out what view has been configured, and if it is a JSP or a Velocity, based on the configuration the view will be prepared, and the information from the model, if it is a POJO, will be accessed from that bean and will be put into that view, and the response will be sent back. So the view relies on model to get some information to be put into that page, and response will be sent. So this is a basic architecture of the Spring 3 MVC. Let us see a more detailed view of how the request flows into it, and what are the components that actually handle this request in a more detailed way. When a request lands up, it is the locale resolver is the component which will be invoked to capture the locale of the request. This shows that Spring 3 very actively supports the internationalization concept. The reason why locale resolver is the first component which handles request is that to make all the properties that are related to a particular language, are getting ready to cater to that response. So the locale will be captured in the first instance, and then it will be checked if the request is landing up with a multi-part MIME type header or not. So if it is a multi-part, it is known that the file is getting transferred or from the server or from the client, and as per that the components will be getting ready to handle that request. And after that, it is the handler mapping which the responsibility is given, and handler mapping will give the information of what is a component that needs to be invoked, what is a controller that needs to be invoked, and then the responsibility will be given to the handler chain. This handler chain is responsible to invoke some of the interceptors that needs to be invoked before a controller and after the controller. That means interceptors are here, they are very similar to filters, where they'll help to separate the pre-process logic and the post-process logic. So if you have a logic that is spread across the controllers, you can separate them into pre-process logic or post-process. So once a controller is invoked and after the controller is finishes its process, these are the logic that will be present in the interceptors. And once the interceptors finish processing a request, the controller will be given to the view resolver, and the view resolver, based on your configuration, decides on what is the view technology that needs to be used, and it prepares the view and sends the response back to the client. So this is the important request flow handled by the Spring MVC framework. I have not included some of the other components like handler adapters and theme resolvers or something like that, because most of the time they will not be part of the flow, or at least they'll not be used for the most of the time. That's the reason why I didn't put it into this diagram. So let us see what are the components that will be initialized by the dispatcher servlet in Spring MVC 3. So first thing that will be initialized is the multi-part resolver, which helps to identify the multi-part headers and start processing through for that file transfers and all. And then the second one is the locale resolver that will be loaded, and it decides upon whether I have to track the locale in a request header, or do I need to get the locale from the cookie, or do I need to get it from a session, something like that. So as per your configuration, the locale resolver acts as such. And then it is a theme resolver that will be loaded up. Theme resolver helps to identify what is the CSS or what is the theme that needs to be sent back to the client based on the role or whatever configuration. And then it is a handler mapping, which helps to have the map of URLs and the controller that needs to be invoked. And then the handler adapters, which actually tell to route your request to another framework's actions or controllers that are part of the other MVC frameworks. But most of the time we don't use handler adapters, because Spring 3 itself is capable to work as an MVC framework and helps gives you more advantages like dependency injection and aspect oriented programming. So most of the time Spring 3 MVC itself will suffice for your needs. And then it is the handler exception resolvers, which will help to understand what if there is any exception that is occurring. It will identify what is the JSP that needs to be sent to the client for this particular exception, if this particular exception occurs. So it decides, you can configure if a particular exception occurs, then please forward this kind of page, something like that. So you can have a customized exception pages in your application. And finally it is the request to view name translator and view resolvers, which decide upon what view needs to be sent and what is the page that needs to be picked for the particular request. So these are the interfaces that are part of the framework, which actually represent each and every component. So you can have your own components that implement these interfaces, and you can give it to Spring MVC. But Spring MVC 3 framework already have some of the default implementation of these components. So this is being given for your information of what with what bean name they are already configured inside the framework, and the purpose of each and every interface. We have discussed about all these components just now, and let us look into the configuration part. Here it is the web.xml what we are seeing, and I have configured the dispatcher servlet here. You can see that servlet name is given as Spring 3. This is very important, because your configuration files related to the Spring 3 MVC framework should start with this servlet name. Without this name, the Spring framework will not be able to identify your servlet.xml or some other files. And also you can see that I have given this component should be loaded on first priority. That means load on startup as first priority. So when the application starts, this component will be loaded first, and this leads to the initialization of all the components that are needed by the framework to process the request. So here I have given that any URL with any extension needs to be handled. Apart from the configuration of the dispatcher servlet, we should also configure another XML in the context config location. That is the XML which will have the details of the bean wiring. So it can be Spring context.xml, or some of your customized name can be there, and this will be loaded by the context loader listener. We'll say about this configuration when we start doing an example. And the most important part is that you should have an Spring 3-servlet.xml which will be automatically loaded when the application starts. And please remember, you should not forget to give a component scan base package which will have the controllers into it. That means in Spring 3, all the controllers are actually configured using annotations. So to scan through the annotations and get the information about what URL this particular controller handles, you need to give this tag. And here with this handler mapping, we are telling to the Spring 3 MVC framework that we are going to use the annotation handler mapping concepts. So this is the default annotation handler mapping, and annotation method handler is the other one which is actually used to route to our controllers automatically. So this is the basic part of the XML configuration. We'll see more details about the configuration, and we'll execute an example in the Spring configuration session, that is in the next session. So visit java9s.com and don't miss to listen to the session 2. Thank you.